Today, it rests in Turin Cathedral, undisturbed and unseen for years at a time in a bomb-proof case. Its survival is its own miracle. These scars are burns from a fire in 1532. Somehow, the damage left the image virtually unscathed. The front and back of a body had left an imprint, as if the body had been wrapped like this. This image became even more significant when it was exposed to the new science of photography. This early process involved an intermediary stage when light and shade were reversed to create a negative. Lo and behold, the shadowy image became much more striking as later and better photographs of the whole cloth confirmed. Would science be able to unlock its secrets? Eventually, these images arrived for inspection by forensic pathologists.
To a person experienced in the examination of injuries, this is a particularly interesting case.
And the cloth itself was subjected to the most minute scientific scrutiny by the American-led Shroud of Turin research project, known as STURP. The first selfie. The Dead Sea Scrolls had recently been validated by a carbon-14 test as being 2,000 years old. A clamour to apply the test to the shroud built, and, eventually, the Vatican began to assemble a team to consider it. Wisely, the team would include archaeologists, the scientists who work with C-14 day to day. William Meacham, here on the right, was selected and attended the first meeting in Turin on the 28th September 1986.
Every competent archaeologist knows that C-14 dating is not an infallible technique. In most cases, it does produce a valid date, as for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the Dead Sea Scrolls had been stored in clay jars, undisturbed, in a cave for the intervening millennia. The shroud, on the other hand, was missing for centuries in unknown environments. Then it was handled by hundreds, possibly thousands of workers, pilgrims, clerics, in very unsanitary times, in extremely different climates, in CO2-rich and high-humidity atmospheres. It was even boiled in oil, according to one text. And the most important in my view, it was burnt in a fire centuries after it was manufactured. Now, one can never be certain that material of more recent age has not been trapped in the structure of the cellulose, that some skilled repair was not done on the edges, that isotope exchange has not taken place. It is absurd to trust C-14 to produce an absolute calendar age for such an object.
With this advice in mind, 5 protocols were established to ensure the test would be as definitive as possible. Multiple sample areas. A simultaneous comprehensive examination led by STURP that would also ensure the most suitable sample areas were chosen. All 7 major C-14 labs to be given samples. The test would be blind to the labs. They would be given linen from the shroud and control samples, but not told which was which. No conferring between the labs, and the results would be published by Turin when all tests were complete. A New York lawyer and author of The Quantum Christ, John Klotz, has made a study of what happened next.
Dating the shroud would validate the C-14 lab's new AMS process and turn it into a commercial gold mine. They wanted that badly, but STURP's participation was a problem. The labs needed the spotlight for themselves. They wanted STURP eliminated from the process. Professor Carlos Chagas, head of the Pontifical Academy of Science, sided with the labs and convinced Pope John Paul that the multiple tests STURP put forward carried risk for the safety of the shroud, which the single C-14 test did not. That was bunk, but Chagas carried the day. STURP was out. Apart from losing STURP's wide-ranging program of tests, the selection of the sample for testing would be made without the input of the only scientist that had thoroughly analyzed the cloth and its composition. But the worst was yet to come. Much worse.
One comes from Egypt and dates to about the 1st century AD.
Dr. Michael Tite, head of research at the British Museum, was appointed as independent adjudicator. He was also charged with locating control samples of other linens to ensure that the test could be carried out blind. This proved impossible. This crucial detail was swept under the carpet, but it meant that the blind test protocol was secretly scrapped. Professor Luigi Garnella from Turin University was placed in direct control of the C-14 tests, as he had been for STURP's previous examination. This had only involved non-destructive testing, but C-14 is different.
The sample is not big, but it is a destructive test. So the problem was to balance the amount of information and the amount of damage.
Despite the protocols, Garnella decided to restrict the testing to a single sample area. Another protocol scrapped. This made the sample selection process even more critical. But the STURP team, who could best advise on site selection, had been vetoed. Another protocol scrapped. For technical and political reasons, Michael Tite agreed that 4 of the original 7 labs selected would be dropped. Another protocol scrapped. With the accumulation of these decisions, any possibility for the Turin authorities to coordinate publication of the results and to keep the labs from conferring was lost. The last protocol disappeared by default. So why, with all the protocols to make sure the test was definitively abandoned, did the test go ahead?
The Vatican was in a difficult position. There was simply too much momentum. So they let the process continue, my worst fears played out, and a great injustice was done to the Shroud. The C-14 dating cannot be definitive, especially since they took the only sample from just about the worst possible place.
One thing we know for certain, the Shroud was kept folded or rolled, and whenever it was shown, which was often, it had to be held up. The only practical way was for it to be clutched along the edge and corners for hours on end, often in stifling heat. This most famous and holy of all relics made personal contact with it a powerful quest for anyone who had access, and they took every advantage. Wear and tear was inevitable. So, when the time finally came, where would they decide to take the single sample from? Looking on were not those best qualified to judge, but the heads of the C-14 labs whose machinations had left them in pole position. They chose the worst possible place. A corner. An area most likely to have needed the kind of repair that we now know took place down the centuries. British researcher Pam Moon has recently shown that it should have been self-evident to those taking the sample that the chosen location was completely inappropriate.
This is an image that was taken immediately after the carbon-14 sample had been cut from the Shroud of Turin, and you can see the cut here. What's interesting is that this is the backing cloth that it rested on, and you can see 2 different colours in the backing cloth. This is a colour of unbleached cotton, and here is a more orangey colour, which is artificial. What's interesting is that the shroud is the same colour as this artificial coloration on the backing cloth. This is another angle of the C-14 sample being cut. This is the natural colour of the shroud linen, but the corner area was discoloured by proximity to these burns. It would have been natural for any repairs here to be made to blend in. We know the shroud needed repair and was repaired from time to time. Researchers like Joe Marino and Sue Benford in the States And Donna Campbell from Thomas Ferguson Irish Linen found inconsistencies and reweave in the corner. Maybe the shroud was also dyed, both the corner and the backing cloth. I knew that Ray Rogers, a member of STURP, found evidence of madder root on some fibres taken from the same area as the C-14 sample. I went to see an expert on dyes and dyeing, Teresina Roberts, at her studio in Birmingham to see what this might mean. Ray Rogers found that there was madder root dye in the corner. Teresina showed me the madder root that bears the colour, and gum tragacanth used to make it stick to the fabric, and the chemical alum that is used to make the cloth receptive and absorb the dye. Ray Rogers had found evidence of all three substances on the fibres. This is a close-up of the C-14 sample given to Oxford for testing, which has only just recently been released. There is a visible frosting of minute bubbles of gum. These would not have been apparent when the sample was taken, but even if they had, the labs would not have been too worried, as the sample would be treated with an acid solution designed to remove the contaminants. We know the dilution used. Most significantly, Rogers found that the acid solution required to remove the dye and gum from the threads was much higher. Rogers also found cotton interwoven with the linen, affirming the repair hypothesis. This would also serve to produce a much younger date if, undetected, it was included within the sample to be tested. I think we can now be absolutely certain that by allowing these all-important protocols to be abandoned, they really did choose the worst possible place to take the one and only sample for C-14 testing.